Hi friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. The Outer Rim, the final frontier of the galaxy, a region of space so massive that it could easily fit the entire core region within its boundaries many times over. For most of galactic history, those who lived in the Outer Rim carved out a very different existence from those who lived in the core regions of the galaxy. The Outer Rim folks were rugged and hardened individuals seeking economic opportunity, freedom, and privacy. Not all that different from the early pioneers here on Earth who crossed the Atlantic and made a new life on these once foreign shores. There's something beautiful about finding and claiming unspoiled land, and then having the freedom to do whatever you want with it without oversight from government or corporate interests. It's not surprising that Disney, after failing to make their own mark on Disney with the sequel trilogy, are now venturing into the unknown region and the Outer Rim. We know that Disney has been trying to make their own mark on Star Wars and somehow make it out of the giant shadow of George Lucas's creations. Which is hard because Star Wars as a franchise has a multi-generational fan base. For some people, Star Wars was a constant throughout their entire life, so Luke, Han, and Chewie for many are like family members. And when people grow attached to these characters, well, they also develop a sense of ownership over those characters. So when Disney brings back old characters like Luke and portrays them in a certain way that doesn't fit the vision of a Star Wars fan, then it might create some tension and anger. Just like the core region of the galaxy, Star Wars lore doesn't like a lot of change. There's already existing rules and traditions and culture that you kind of have to follow. And so it's not surprising that several of Disney's future enterprises will be taking place in the outer rim of the galaxy with characters that are also new and unknown. For a creator, any limitations because of backstory and lore really do end up hurting the end product and I guess limits the artist's vision. Rian Johnson, for instance, is by far one of the most talented directors to ever make a Star Wars film, but his ego, artistic integrity destroyed the continuity of the trilogies, making the whole series kind of a mess. A better option for someone like Rian Johnson would be to send him out to the Outer Rim, give him a whole new cast of characters that no one's ever heard of, and allow him to weave his own cool story. I hope that's what they're going to do with Taika Waititi, because he's also an author and an extremely talented director that shouldn't be held back by pre-existing lore, in my opinion. Now, it seems like Disney has finally figured this out. Rogue One first introduced a cast of fun characters that were completely new and therefore had very few expectations tied to them. And now Din Djarin and Baby Yoda's success marks a new milestone for Disney's transition to taking over Star Wars. Now, the same things that make the Outer Rim appealing to pioneers and also entertainment mega conglomerates also makes it kind of a strange and difficult place to settle in too. You trade a lot of things for the freedom and wildness of the Outer Rim. This includes safety, security, stability, infrastructure, and many other things. And this unfortunately rang true for most of galactic history. Whether it was the Old Republic or New Republic or the Empire, no one really had a good solution on how to develop and keep the Outer Rims under control. So how do we stabilize the Outer Rim? Where did the Republic and Empires go wrong with their policy? Well, the Old Republic's policy was always a little more hands-off, more laissez-faire. Their idea was that, eventually people who were tired of living in the more crowded, regulated areas would spring outwards, whether it was pioneers or private businesses, and they would slowly develop the border areas of the galaxy. And over a course of several thousands of years, it did work. I mean, that's why the so-called expansion region is sandwiched between the inner rim and mid-rim. At one point, the expansion region was the outer rim. But then around 17,000 BBY, the Coruscanti government along with the Alsacan government started funding exploration missions into the expansion region, and it became pretty well settled. But these outer areas of the Republic, whether it was the expansion region in 17,000 BBY or the Outer Rim in 100 BBY, faced the same problems throughout the course of Republic's history. The Old Republic was supposed to be a democratic republic. Each member planet technically was supposed to have an elected official representing them in the Senate. But for most of galactic history, the Republic Senate had only around 2,000 representatives. Some individual planets like Alderaan, for instance, were old and important enough to have direct representation from one individual senator. But since there were more than 1 million worlds in the Old Republic, you couldn't have one-to-one representation for each planet. And so some of the newer planets, and by new I mean like, a few thousand years in the Republic instead of tens of thousands of years in the Republic, were mostly represented on a sector level or a regional level. The reality was that the waiting list for direct representation in the Old Republic Senate was more ridiculous and uncertain than the Tesla Cybertruck pre-order line. So why would an Outer Rim planet join the Old Republic if they're not going to get representation, but then they're also forced to pay taxes and abide by tariffs and trade regulations? Well, because without former diplomatic relations with the Old Republic, you can't have access to the massive Old Republic economy. Without access, your colony will probably die and fade away. And while you're in the waiting process of being approved to be a member of the Old Republic, you have no assurances that it will actually happen. You don't know what the timeline is going to be, and throughout the whole period of time, you have to try your hardest not to piss off the core regions. Worse, you're seeing all of your hard-earned revenue disappear into the massive bureaucratic mess that is the Old Republic. This obviously creates some really bad relationships between the Outer Rim and core regions of the galaxy. But unequal representation in a republic isn't exactly a new thing. I mean, we have it here in America with the Electoral College and the Upper House. And there are pros and cons to the way our government approaches things. Given the current trend of population migration to urban centers and more blue areas of the country, city dweller numbers are quickly eclipsing those in rural areas of the United States, even with the recent COVID pandemic. And while most Americans, no matter where they are, share some very common beliefs and values, there are certain regional and cultural traditions that can be a little bit different, like the subject of gun laws and gun control. According to the polls, 52% of Americans believe that gun laws should be stricter in America, whereas only 18% believe that gun laws need to be less strict. If we had a referendum today that had some pretty reasonable but further restrictions on buying guns in America at the federal level, it would most likely pass during a popular vote. And that makes sense because the majority of people do live in urban areas, and having a gun is a pretty terrible idea in these areas because even when a well-trained police officer shoots off their weapon, there's a high chance civilian casualties and collateral damage will occur. But on the other hand, you might have people living in more rural areas who own large swaths of land or like to go hunting. In these areas, gun ownership is a much better idea and it's almost encouraged for good reason. Especially in the coastal areas where the dolphin menace has been attempting to establish beachheads using advanced exoskeletons made out of barnacles and seaweed. And so in America, to make sure our friends in the rural areas aren't just drowned out by the massive populations in these urban centers, we have certain things like, for instance, 2 senators for each state, no matter what your population is. I mean, this is why California, with its population of 39 million people, has the same amount of senators as Alaska, which only has a population of 730,000 living people and about 500,000 undead vampires who enjoy the month-long darkness the northern areas of the state gets exposed to during the winter. It's an imperfect situation. A lot of people in urban areas are kind of upset that their votes don't count as much, but America has always championed the voices and rights of minority groups. It's not just about mob rule, right? The Old Republic solution is much more unfair than our current system, of course. In exchange for taxation, most of these Outer Rim areas get no representation and, worse yet, no services or support. But in defense of the Old Republic, most government systems cease to work efficiently once they are scaled up to a certain size. I mean, heck, even something as crazy as communism works if it's just you and your immediate family. This is also why all across our Earth, some of the most efficient cities are city-states and completely autonomous from outside influences. We're talking about areas like Singapore and, once upon a time, Hong Kong. Rest in peace, Hong Kong. The Old Republic was simply too large. It was too inundated with corruption and inefficiency, and it just wasn't a really good system. Also, at the same time, you didn't want to have a million different representatives in the Senate because that would just create a crazy environment. But the main problem with the development of the Outer Rim was simply that the amount of credits and resources that would be required to protect and serve the Outer Rim was simply too high for the very meager amount of tax money the Old Republic was able to collect from the area. The Outer Rim really suffered from a lack of manpower. It also suffered from a lack of capital investment. The establishment of the free trade zone in the Outer Rim in 124 BBY was seen as a step in the right direction. Now, the leaders of the Old Republic saw the same things that we were just talked about, and so they wanted to attract capital investment and hopefully encourage the development of permanent infrastructure in this area. This would decrease crime, increase travel and immigration to the area, which would jumpstart commerce in the region. But labeling the Outer Rim a free trade zone is sort of suggesting that the Old Republic already had control of the area and was maintaining custom offices and security patrols on the shipping lanes, which of course they weren't. I mean, the Old Republic at the point was a joke. They didn't even have a standing military at the time. And so the corporations who ventured to the Outer Rim didn't just develop the area, they basically took complete control in the vacuum that the government left them. They basically established small fiefdoms in resource-rich systems and were unstoppable. What followed, of course, was rampant abuse. You had slaves, indentured servants, price fixing, debt trapping, all of the worst things you could possibly imagine. Thanks to the lack of tariffs, cheap labor costs, and plentiful resources, these new Outer Rim corporations had become major players and used their wealth to buy direct representation in the Senate. And so when the free trade zone was dismantled, they were furious. This would obviously throw their business strategies and cost models out the window. This would eventually lead to the creation of the Separatist Crisis and the Clone Wars. The Empire, on the other hand, tried a different strategy. Palpatine wanted a heavily planned economy with most major industries nationalized and directed towards the purpose of creating a massive military-industrial complex. Palpatine wanted boots on the ground everywhere in the galaxy, but the reality was that from a cost structure point of view, there was never going to be enough Star Destroyers to patrol every planet. And so the Outer Rim was, once again, more or less neglected during this time period. The Death Star approach from the Tarkin Doctrine strategy didn't work either. A giant battle station wasn't going to be able to scare the Outer Rim into productivity. So what is the solution? How would I approach this? Well, I think the key to developing the Outer Rim is first creating stability. You kind of need stability in any neighborhood where you want to grow wealth and better services, right? At the same time, I also believe that the Outer Rim shouldn't have been opened up to corporations without stipulations. The government should have first and foremost focused on creating safe hyperspace lanes into the area and then maintaining those strategic infrastructure points. By having substantial trade routes, you can decrease the cost of travel to these areas and at the same time increase the amount of goods flowing back and forth from the Outer Rim to the core and establish supply chains. At the same time, the Old Republic should have opened up like a Bureau of Federal, land acquisition and basically given free land to pioneers in order to attract more people to go to these Outer Rim areas. It's similar to the land handouts that attracted pioneers to the American West in the early 19th century. Instead of attracting corporate interests and just giving them massive amounts of freedom, give it to individuals who are willing to move there and live there and establish a life. Creating hyperspace lanes and giving out free land isn't exactly expensive. The Old Republic would be able to afford such projects. The government will subsidize pioneers and help them by waiving land fees. This allows new settlers to spend all of their money instead on building materials and establishing sustainable settlements that are built for living and not just for short-term profits. I would first test out the strategy on just one sector of space, maybe just on one planet, and iron out all of the fine details. The first worlds will need to have some strategic resource that can be mined or collected and then shipped back to the core region for income. Also, at the beginning, these settlements should be run by Republic military personnel or at least Jedi or judicial personnel. Once things stabilize enough, then a local government can be set up by the settlers and the program can be repeated on other worlds. I'm not completely against giving corporations access to this area, but in the beginning at least, you do need some protection over these very small settlements. But eventually, you could open up these areas for corporate contracts. For instance, the Republic could give mining rights and a tax abatement to a corporation and ask for, in return, discounted raw materials for building settlements. The ultimate goal is to create efficient settlements that are self-sustainable and that can continue to grow in, again, a sustainable way. That way, eventually, you can have, enough money to build a defense force or some kind of security force and have a self-sustainable colony that will actually survive without much input from the Republic. Ultimately, a short-sighted leader will try to make sure his constituents are well taken care of and help him secure re-election. A big picture leader will instead try the best to improve the lives of those who are disenfranchised and marginalized. Areas that lack economic growth opportunities usually fall victim to crime or extreme kind of political and religious points of view, and that generally creates instability, and you don't want that. In the long run, the Old Republic will have to invest a substantial amount of resources to fix the problems of the Outer Rim so that it doesn't grow out of control like during the Clone Wars. What you really also need is policy that is a little more focused and a little more specific. You can't just have broad terms like free trade zones that can be easily exploited by people from all directions. Anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. As usual, thanks for joining us today. If you're watching this, you are Generation Tech.